The Russian President Vladimir Putin has offered direct talks with Ukraine in the Turkish city of Istanbul next Thursday. In a late-night news conference, President Putin said that Moscow wanted serious negotiations to remove what he called the root causes of the conflict. Mr. Putin made the announcement after the leaders of Britain, France, Germany and Poland, visiting Kyiv on Saturday, called for a 30-day truce from Monday. Let's hear from more of what Mr. Putin had to say.
We propose to the Kyiv authorities to resume the talks they stopped and terminated in April 2022. I'm referring to direct talks without any preconditions, and we propose to start immediately on next Thursday, on the 15th of May in Istanbul.
President Putin will, for more on that press conference that took place at 2 o'clock Russian time, or Moscow time to be more precise. Here's our Russia editor at BBC Monitoring, Vitaly Shevchenko.
It was a very, very unusual late-night statement by Vladimir Putin. The media in Moscow were first told that he was about to make an important statement, and they had to wait for more than an hour. When he finally appeared, he started talking first about the string of meetings he had with various foreign leaders who visited Moscow for Victory Day on the 9th of May. And then he got to the most important point in his statement, that Moscow is proposing direct talks with Ukraine, and he said that they need to start without delay as early as next Thursday on the 15th of May in Istanbul. Importantly, Vladimir Putin alluded to previous objections that Moscow voiced to the idea of a ceasefire in Ukraine. He said that nobody needs a peace that leads to more conflict after Ukrainian forces receive more weapons from the West and more fighters. So it looks like he's trying to pass the ball into Ukraine's court after a meeting of Ukrainian allies in Kyiv earlier today, who said that Russia must agree to a full and unconditional ceasefire on Monday, the 12th of May, or more sanctions would be imposed on Russia. So it is possible that this kind of pressure is working and Vladimir Putin is responding to it. Is he dragging his feet yet again? We don't know. But the key takeaway from his statement is that Moscow is seeking talks with Ukraine, and the message to people like Donald Trump would be that we are being constructive here, we're being open here, do not sanction us more.
Vitaly Shevchenko there from BBC Monitoring. So, as we've been hearing, Mr. Putin's comments come just hours after the leaders of Britain, France, Germany and Poland visiting Kyiv on Saturday called for a 30-day truce from Monday. From there, our chief political correspondent Henry Zeffman now reports.
Solidarity arriving on the sleeper train. Sir Keir Starmer's second visit to Ukraine as Prime Minister, but his first with company.
What do we do now?
What now? First, solemnity. These flags at Kyiv's Independence Square commemorate Ukraine's war dead. Then a meeting of the Coalition of the Willing, the rest of its 30 or so members patched in by video link. Today they agreed on a specific demand.
Since Monday, 12th of May, a full and unconditional ceasefire must start for at least 30 days. We, together, demanded from Russia.
In a week where we commemorated the end of a war in Europe, these European leaders have come here to Kyiv to see a war in Europe. This is a deliberately symbolic visit. It's designed as a response to Putin and his posse of leaders in Moscow the day before. For Ukraine, these days bring clarity. Who's with them and who's against them. But who's America with? President Trump first suggested the 30-day plan. After the group meeting, President Macron got his phone out and dialed him up. Historical moments, the caption read.
We haven't seen unity like this pretty well throughout the conflict. So to get the European allies US,
But Russia are
New
saying,
Zealand,
shove these peace plans.
Canada, all on one page. Putin, of course, cannot be trusted, but this now is a unified call for an unconditional ceasefire, backed up by sanctions.
Unity, solidarity, willingness, none of these are in doubt. But is it enough to justify these leaders' faith that they can change the course of this war? Henry Zeffman, BBC News, Kyiv.
Our security correspondent Frank Gardner has more.
The response, as we've seen, to yesterday's call for a full 30-day ceasefire by Ukraine and its allies is this extraordinary late-night conference, late-night press conference that President Putin called in Moscow, where he has said, I want direct talks with Ukraine on Thursday. The Kremlin's very good at muddying the waters like this because they've not agreed to this 30-day ceasefire that everyone here was demanding. And instead, President Putin said, let's address the root causes of this conflict. Now, Russia's idea of the root causes of this conflict are very different from the West's idea of the root causes. Putin sees the problem as Ukraine being lured into the West. He doesn't want Ukraine joining the EU or NATO or looking westwards. He wants it back in Moscow's sphere of influence in the way that Belarus is and that he would like other countries to be that used to be former members of the Soviet Union. So I'm not optimistic that that is going to work, but President Putin has pointed out that there were direct talks back in 2022, soon after the full-scale invasion in Istanbul, between Ukraine and Russia, and he says the West made Ukraine walk away from those talks. There is an element of truth in that, but so much has changed since then, and this country, Ukraine, has come under absolute vicious bombardment day in, day out. So many people have been killed, as they have on the Russian side of the front lines too, and Ukraine has developed its own very effective drone industry where it's able to do long-range strikes deep into Russia. It's even been able to get its drones to penetrate Moscow's air defenses. So a lot's moved on, and I think the gap between the two sides, Russia and Ukraine, is as wide as ever. There is no common ground.
What do you make of this at a time of the softening, apparent softening of the US position? It appears that the coalition of the willing, as it's called within Europe, has tightened and strengthened.
Yes, I mean, yesterday was partly symbolic that you got the first time 4 leaders of major European countries all arrived here at the same time in Kyiv to show their support the day after Moscow's victory parade, which, by the way, I agree with you. I think it was a success for President Putin, that parade. He's not as isolated as the West would like. The West may not like some of the nations, some of the policies that people who were there, people like Maduro or Venezuela, but nevertheless, he's not isolated. So the pressure is on diplomatically. President Putin knows he's got to respond. He has responded with his counteroffer. But I think once people wake up here in Ukraine, it's still pretty early and it's a Sunday, obviously. Once we get full responses, I'm pretty sure Ukraine is going to dismiss Russia's reaction to this, saying, no, look, you've been given a clear choice here. Sign up to a full 30-day comprehensive ceasefire tomorrow, Monday, starting then on land and sea and air. If you don't, you face bigger sanctions. Now, there's no question that countries like the UK and France would like to impose those tougher sanctions and increase military aid to Ukraine. The big unknown is what's going on inside Donald Trump's head, because as you heard from Professor Fish there, Donald Trump likes Putin. They've got a history going back. He wants to do business with Putin. President Trump wants to get US businesses back into Russia. He wants a deal. And so who knows which way it's going to go? Is he going to get tough? Is he going to deliver on his earlier threat of secondary sanctions, of punishing countries that buy Russian oil, important countries like China and India? Or is he going to have more direct talks, send Steve Witkoff off to Moscow or St. Petersburg again, to be embraced literally with open arms by Vladimir Putin and cut a deal over the heads of Ukraine and its European allies? That's the big unknown here.
Frank Gardner there. Steve Fish is a professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley, and author of Democracy Derailed in Russia, The Failure of Open Politics. He gave me his take on why President Putin had suddenly called for these talks with Ukraine.
Well, Putin is now been set back on his heels. Putin always assumed that Europe didn't have real leaders and that Europeans weren't willing to sacrifice anything for Ukraine. He's now seeing that that might not be true. Europe is actually proving so far to actually have leaders. 4 leaders plus Zelensky who are willing to step up and stand up to Putin. This is something Putin wasn't anticipating. And they seem willing even to basically fill the gap that the United States has created by withdrawing as strong a support from Ukraine as it had under the Biden administration. This is what Putin is worried about. Putin is also a little bit worried that maybe his control over Trump is less complete than it used to be. We have to remember that Trump is Putin's boy. He has been all the way back to 2016. Trump thinks that Putin helped him get elected, which he did to begin with. He wants what Putin has. He admires Putin. But recently, Trump has discovered that he can make, as much money as he wants from his time in office out of, cryptocurrency schemes and things like that. And it might be coming clear to Trump now he doesn't need Putin for an additional several billion. He doesn't need Putin's support. He might see himself now as bigger than Putin. Oddly enough, although that's a strange way to get here, this might actually soften the unequivocality of Trump's support for Putin. And Putin senses that as well. That's what's going on here.
Right. But if you look to the last few days and Victory Day and the parade that we saw in Russia and Moscow, it doesn't look as if President Putin is particularly isolated on the world stage, much less so, for example, than he was 2 or 3 years ago.
Well, the main difference is that Trump is in office and Trump sides with Putin. That's the main difference. When it comes to isolation among other powers, what we've seen actually is Europe again really stand up. We've seen East Asian democracies, Japan, stand up. Japan is now saying that it's going to share intelligence with Ukraine. We've seen most of the world's rich leading democracies siding unequivocally with Ukraine and reinforcing their support for Ukraine now that American support seems to have softened under Trump. The fact that, Trump can get South Africa or Brazil to vote with it in some UN resolution means something, but it really isn't as big a deal as what Putin is now seeing Europe do and East Asia do as well.
Professor Fish there.